Hello, so this little video is all about osmosis and it's part of osmosis and plant transport. Now before we get started, it's really important that you can actually recall a little bit of information. So over here we have got a little animal cell and over here we've got a plant cell. So pause it here and see if you can remember what each of these labels are. So at the top we've got the cell membrane, which both plant and animal cells have, and you might remember that this controls what enters or leaves the cell. Then we've got the cytoplasm, which is where some important chemical reactions take place. We have the chloroplast, which is only found in plant cells, and they are there to trap light. We have got, going around the outside, the nuclear membrane, which basically controls what enters and leaves the nucleus. Then underneath we have the nucleus, which contains the cell's DNA and controls its activities. Then this thing here is going to be really important in this topic. This big thing is the vacuole, and it contains cell sap. Its main function is to store water or store sap and support the cell. And then lastly we have the cell wall, which is only found in plant cells, and again it supports the cell and really importantly stops the cell bursting if it takes in too much water. Now another really important concept here is diffusion. So we looked at diffusion in a previous topic in cells, and we said it was the movement of particles in a gas or liquid from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So in this little animation at the side, what we can see is that all the particles start off in this area where they were in high concentration, and they spread out all over the place to areas of low concentration until they're pretty much evenly spread out. Now we've looked at several examples of this. We looked at how oxygen diffuses from the lungs, and being more specific, that would be the alveoli to the blood, and carbon dioxide also diffuses out of the blood to the lungs. And this just shows you a little animation of it. So here we have the alveolus in the center with the capillary around the outside, and what you can see is the oxygen which is breathed in diffuses into the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood. Now the reason why we're starting off looking at diffusion is because this video is all about osmosis, and osmosis is basically a special type of diffusion. And it's a special type of diffusion because it involves the movement of water molecules. So these water molecules are going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration through a selectively permeable membrane. And that is your definition of osmosis. It involves the movement of water molecules from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration through a selectively permeable membrane. Now that might be, for example, e.g. the cell membrane. So this little diagram shows you what that might look like. So here we have an area outside the cell. This is the cell membrane, and this is the area inside the cell. So what we can see here is these little water molecules move from an area of high concentration through a selectively permeable membrane to an area of low concentration. So in this case, water enters the cell by osmosis. Now this just shows you a slightly different example. So in this diagram we have got water molecules, which are the little blue ones, and sugar molecules, which are the little orangey yellow ones. And what we're saying is osmosis occurs across a semi-permeable membrane which has tiny holes in it. The holes are small enough for water molecules to pass through, but larger molecules cannot pass through it. So what's going to happen here is the water molecules will be able to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration through the selectively permeable membrane. So here they go. Now the water molecules can pass through because they're small enough, but these larger sugar ones can't because they're too big. Now, we've looked at the movement of substances several times. So we've looked at diffusion and osmosis. So let's compare the two. So this shows diffusion, which you'll remember is when the particles move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And then osmosis is the movement of just water molecules from an area of high concentration to low concentration across a selectively permeable membrane. So two little differences here. Firstly, osmosis is the movement of only water molecules, and it usually happens across a selectively permeable membrane. So there has to be two solutions which are separated by a membrane. Whereas diffusion can happen pretty much in any solid, liquid or gas where you have particles which can move about. We've also looked at active transport before. Now this little handy table just shows you a comparison of them. So we have diffusion, osmosis and active transport. Now which particles can move by diffusion? It's pretty much any small molecules, whereas osmosis, it is the movement of water molecules only. Active transport is again any small particle. And you can see here how diffusion and osmosis are similar. Particles move from an area of high concentration to low concentration in both, whereas active transport is the odd one out here. It moves particles from a low to a high concentration. Diffusion and osmosis are also very similar because they don't need energy from respiration, whereas active transport does. Then we've got some little examples of each one here. So the ones for diffusion we've talked about is oxygen entering the blood, food entering the blood, and carbon dioxide leaving the blood. Then we have for osmosis a few little things which we're going to look at. So water entering cells, potatoes absorbing water, roots absorbing water. And a good example of active transport would be roots absorbing nitrates. Now let's look at how you actually explain this in some questions. So take this diagram above. Now in this diagram you've got an area inside the cell here. You've got an area outside the cell, and here you've got a high water concentration and a low water concentration, and then you've got the selectively permeable membrane. So this is diagram 1. It's left for a little bit of time, and then let's say for example 1 hour. Then this is diagram 2. So this shows what has happened. So in these questions I'm going to get you to try and explain this. In osmosis questions you always have to try and include several things. Which way does water move? Now that's just in general. So which way does water move in general? And then how does that happen? And does water enter or leave the cell? So pause it here and see if you can write me a little answer for this question, and then we'll look at what you do. So firstly, which way does water move? Water moves from an area of high concentration to low concentration through a selectively permeable membrane. How? By osmosis. And then does water enter or leave the cell? Water enters the cell in this case because it moves from an area of high concentration outside to an area of low concentration inside. So your overall answer would be this. Water moves from an area of high concentration to low concentration through a selectively permeable membrane by osmosis, so water enters the cell. So the lesson here is anytime you're explaining what's happening in osmosis, you usually need to give the definition, the word osmosis, and say whether water enters or leaves cells.